The member for Kooyong.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this parliament has seen many significant contests over recent years. The GST, the Iraq War and Telstra's privatisation all spring to mind. But in my brief parliamentary career, the debate over the carbon tax is certainly the most contentious. It is both because of what it is and because of how it came about. First, it is the most significant economic change we have seen in decades. It is a new tax on everything. Energy powers our way of life. Increase its price and the cost of everything we do and we use goes up. Second, the Prime Minister, 5 days before the last election, emphatically declared in her own words, "There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead." This was a fundamental undertaking to the Australian people, not an off-the-cuff comment made during some laborious parliamentary debate, but a solemn promise made to 23 million Australians who now bear the ultimate burden of her prime ministerial backflip. Without the Prime Minister's promise, millions of Australians would in all likelihood have cast their vote differently, changing the outcome of the election and rewriting the pages of history. In the days leading up to the election, the Prime Minister was acutely aware of how reticent the electorate was to embrace a carbon tax. The Prime Minister was at pains to emphasise that she would first seek a community consensus on the issue via a citizens' assembly before making any preemptive move. But everything was to change once the Prime Minister reached the Lodge and a new government was formed. Wanting to pander to the Greens and secure her minority government, this fundamental pre-election promise was unceremoniously dumped without contrition or atonement. What now follows with this legislation put before us represents a dereliction of prime ministerial duty and a fundamental breach of faith between the parliament and its representatives. The fact too that these 19 bills, more than 1,100 pages long, are being rushed through the parliament with members giving speaking time equivalent to less than 1 minute per bill only compounds the problem. If the Prime Minister was so bold as to say she would wear out her shoe leather selling her tax, why is she not prepared to let her fellow members wear out their voices? Mr Speaker, for me the issue of a carbon tax is not one of belief nor of ideology. It is a test, however, of what is the most effective way of simultaneously enhancing our environment and our economy. Twin objectives that are not mutually exclusive. I am not here to debate the science, but I am here to hold the government to account. I am here to hold the government to account for its misguided decision to pursue a carbon tax in the absence of an international agreement. I am here to hold the government to account for its damaging decision to pursue a carbon tax at a time our industry and households are feeling the pain of a challenging domestic economy. I am here to hold the government to account for a fatally flawed policy that will simply redistribute wealth in society without any commensurate payoff for the environment. This is not just bad policy. It is bad faith. First and foremost, a carbon tax will have a punishing impact on the cost of living. In the very first year alone, a $23 a tonne carbon tax will represent a $515 a year hit to the average household. With electricity bills to increase 10% and gas bills 9%, it is not just the household heating, lighting and cooking bill that will be impacted, but the flow-on effect to the weekly grocery bill will also be significant. What is more, the carbon price has a built-in escalator. It will not be fixed. It starts at $23 a tonne, but on the government's own forecast will jump to $29 in 2016, $37 in 2020 and over $350 in 2050. It is more than a coincidence that the Greens took to the last election a carbon price of $23 a tonne. Now that their figure has become the government's figure, Green senators like Sarah Hanson-Young have started to call for a higher price, namely $100 a tonne. I say to those opposite, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Your support today for a carbon price is locking you into a cycle of an ever-rising tax on every Australian family. It is a heavy responsibility to bear. What is more, the government's entire strategy is flawed. It cannot readily change consumer behaviour. Some goods like energy are relatively inelastic. It doesn't necessarily follow the more you charge, the less you proportionately use. People will simply be forced to pay more, leaving them with significantly less to spend. It too is insufficient for the government to claim that they are compensating the householder. Originally, the Prime Minister and her ministers claimed they would return all the $9 billion raised in the first year back to households. Now we're told it's around 50%. And when it comes to the government's proposed tax cuts, the exact opposite is true. Some of the marginal rates will in fact increase, including from 15% to 19% and 30% to 33%. No wonder, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Treasurer in an interview on Sky News is on the record of saying, and I quote, "We can't guarantee that no one will be worse off." Indeed, in my own electorate of Kooyong, I was contacted by a constituent, Gabriel Whiting, who, as a single self-funded retiree under the age of 65, with an income of $35,000, has been told after repeated calls to the government's Clean Energy Hotline that she will receive no compensation. In fact, using the household assistant estimator on the website, she is $251 worse off. When I asked the Prime Minister in question time about why Ms Whiting, who will pay higher electricity and gas prices under the carbon tax but will receive no compensation, the Prime Minister had no answer. Unfortunately, Gabriel Whiting is no one-off. There are hundreds of thousands like her, left behind by an incompetent Gillard government. Like the average household, small business will also feel the pain of this carbon tax. Don't take my word for it, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is the view of Peter Anderson, CEO of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, employing more than 4 million people, our 2 million small businesses, including more than 10,000 of whom are in Kooyong, are the backbone of the Australian economy. But who will compensate them? My local dry cleaner in Kew told me that his electricity and gas bill has risen in just over a year from $23,000 to $28,000. And with the introduction of a carbon tax, it will rise another 10%. He works 6 days a week, employs 4 others, and is in a daily struggle to meet the higher costs of keeping the doors open. He wants a carbon tax like a hole in the head. So why are we giving him one? This is a sentiment shared by many. Deloitte Access Economics have modelled the regional impacts of a carbon tax in Victoria. They found that by 2015 there will be 23,000 fewer jobs across the state and the economy would be $2.8 billion worse off if the tax goes ahead. According to the Deloitte's document, the Boroondara area, which closely resembles the boundaries of my electorate, would be among the worst hit. What is particularly pernicious about the carbon tax proposed, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the government is going against the international tide. In the United States, a cap-and-trade system is no longer on the agenda. Earlier this year in Canada, Prime Minister Stephen Harper won the most comprehensive electoral victory for the Conservative Party in over 100 years campaigning against a carbon tax. It too is simply false to suggest that rising powers, China and India, are rapidly weaning themselves off their dependence on fossil fuels. In the period between 1990 and 2020, China will increase its emissions by a remarkable 496% and India by 350%. Professor Garneau, in his report, details the projected increase in China emissions between 2005 and 2020 from 5 to 12 billion tonnes of CO2 per annum. With China's growth in emissions 100 times greater than the cuts Australia seeks to make over the same period, it is easy to see that China is where the real game is. In fact, the Productivity Commission has found that Australia is alone among the nations of the world in proposing an economy-wide carbon tax. Little wonder then that so many of our business leaders who are exposed to the global market are deeply concerned about the impact the carbon tax will have on the nation's competitiveness. BHP CEO Marius Kloppers called the tax a deadweight cost on the coal industry, noting that other competitor countries in the market, including South Africa and Indonesia, did not apply a carbon tax. The Gillard government simply fails to appreciate the extent to which Australia is a net importer of capital, relying on foreign investment to fund the development of our lucrative resources sector. Global capital is fungible. It is up for grabs. There is no sentiment involved. Investors go where money is to be made and sovereign risk is limited. If we pursue a punitive carbon and mining tax, it is simply inevitable that investors will take their money elsewhere. This will cost jobs across the economy. The fact that the government has not even had the courage to name those companies it is promising to tax, first numbering 1,000, then 500, now 400, means there is even greater uncertainty among our economy's largest employers. The government makes the mistake of telling us that jobs will be replaced by new jobs in the renewable energy sector. International experience does not bear this out. In a UK study earlier this year, it was found that 3.7 jobs were lost for every green job created. Similar findings were reached in a 2009 Spanish study. Not only does the government's carbon tax raise the spectre of sending Australian jobs offshore, but it also will send billions of dollars of taxpayer funds offshore to buy emission permits. Because the government acknowledges that even with a carbon tax, emissions in Australia are projected to increase by 43 million tonnes, from 578 million tonnes to 621 million tonnes by 2020, they have been forced to allocate $3.5 billion in 2020 to purchase carbon credits. It is hard to believe, but by 2050, funding for these foreign carbon credits is estimated to reach $57 billion per year, or 1.5% of GDP. It is of great concern that Australia will have limited transparency and control over these foreign trading schemes where corruption and fraud is legion. Significantly, the Australian Crime Commission details in its 2011 report the state of international investigations into carbon tax evasion, including in Norway, where Europol is investigating allegations that up to €5 billion of revenue has been lost, and in Italy, where organised crime groups are reportedly tapping into the European wind energy sector. Mr Deputy Speaker, since coming to power in 2007, this government has had an extremely poor record in management and implementation. There is no reason to think that their ability to implement a complex economy-wide carbon tax will be any different from their monumental failures, which we have seen with the school hall, pink bats, green loans and NBN programs. In contrast, the Coalition has put forward a fully funded, costed and incentive and technologically focused alternative with our direct action policy. We will clean up the dirtiest power stations. We will invest in renewable energy and carbon sequestration. We will plant more trees, and we will establish an emissions reduction fund which will source the lowest cost abatement, helping us to achieve the bipartisan commitment to a 5% reduction in CO2 levels by 2020. At $3.2 billion over 4 years, it is a far cry from the Prime Minister's big government, big spending carbon tax, which will hurt the economy without delivering any real environmental benefit. Mr Deputy Speaker, I finish where I started. In my brief career, the parliamentary debate over the government's proposed carbon tax is the most contentious issue which I have been involved. But given its implications for our economy and our future, it is a debate that must be had. Our policy, based on incentives and initiative, will always trump that of a punishing new tax based on a broken promise. In the end, the pages of history and their judgment will be on our side.